My name is Kate. I'm 20 years old, and this happened just this past summer when I came back home for vacation from university. It was one of those spontaneous decisions. I thought, why not surprise my parents? I didn't tell them I was coming, which only made me more excited as I dragged my suitcase through the familiar streets of my small hometown. When I opened the front door, expecting hugs and shocked faces from Mom and Dad, I was greeted by silence. It turned out they weren't home yet. I was just starting to feel a little disappointed when I heard a familiar voice call my name. It was Joe, my little brother who had recently turned 18. Now, 18, he was a bit taller than me and had a broad smile. "That could light up any room, Joe," I exclaimed, dropping my bags as we hugged it. It was one of those easy, natural greetings, but I couldn't help noticing how grown-up he looked. When Joe eventually left, I closed the door and let out a deep breath. The house was so quiet, and the realization that I was truly home began to sink in after the long drive back from university and dealing with crowded buses and noisy train stations. I felt the need to shake off my exhaustion, decided to head straight to the shower. The hot water hit my skin, washing away the grime of travel, and for the first time in weeks, I felt myself begin to relax. It had been a rough semester, full of assignments, deadlines, and the constant rush of UN university life. But now, standing there under the stream of water, I let my shoulders drop and finally exhaled. After my shower, I threw on a loose summer dress. It was light and soft, the kind of outfit you wear when you're not trying too hard, but just want to be comfortable, barefoot. I patted over to my room, pushed open the door, and let the familiar coziness wrap around me. My old posters were still on the walls, and the bed was still made with my favourite patterned sheets. It felt like stepping back into an earlier version of myself, but something else was tugging at the back of my mind. I'd been so busy with school and so focused on work that I hadn't had much of a personal life. Intimacy I used to take for granted had been missing for a while. Sure, there had been dates here and there, but nothing serious, nothing real. And it's not like there were many chances to unwind like that in a shared dorm with thin walls and nosy roommates. As I sank onto my bed, the thought stayed with me. It wasn't just about needing someone else. It was about feeling connected to myself again, feeling in tune with my own needs. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling, aimlessly at first, but it wasn't long before my mind wandered elsewhere, lying back against the pillows. I let my fingers graze my skin. It was instinctive, more about rediscovering myself than anything else. My hands roamed over my arm, my collarbone, and the soft fabric of my dress. I let out a shaky breath, just allowing myself to feel reconnect and unwind after everything I'd been pushing through. I wasn't thinking about much else when I heard a knock at my door. My heart jumped into my throat, and I practically tossed my phone aside. Kate Joe's voice called from the other side, quickly smoothing my dress. I adjusted myself and called for him to come in. Joe opened the door, hesitating for a moment. Before stepping inside, I could tell something was on his mind. His expression was more serious than usual, and he stood there awkwardly for a second before finally making his way to the edge of my bed, sitting down and running a hand through his hair. I didn't know what he wanted, but I figured it had to be important for him to come by. Joe sat down at the edge of my bed, and I could immediately see that something was bothering him. He didn't speak right away, just shifted uncomfortably, looking like he was trying to figure out where to start. I stayed quiet, giving him the space to work through whatever was on his mind. Finally, he began to talk. His words came out haltingly at first, but then the story poured out. He started telling me about his girlfriend, a relationship. I knew he had been in for a while from what I'd heard before. I always thought they were happy together, one of those young carefree relationships where everything seems fun and exciting, but apparently things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Joe told me about how they'd been fighting a lot lately over both little things and big things. He felt like no matter what he did, it wasn't enough to make her happy. She'd get upset with him over things he didn't even realize were a problem, and the arguments always left him feeling drained. He admitted that he cared about her, but wasn't sure if he could keep going like this. The relationship was starting to feel more like a burden than something that brought him joy. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice how much he'd changed since the last time I'd really spent time with him. He wasn't the same kid I used to tease or babysit. He had this quiet maturity about him now, a depth I hadn't seen before. It hit me all at once, how much he'd grown up. And it wasn't just physically, though. His broader shoulders and more defined face were hard to ignore. He carried himself differently, with a confidence that hadn't been there before I listened, as he kept talking my mind, half on his words and half on this new realization about him. There was something magnetic about him now, something that made it hard to look away. It was strange, almost unsettling to see him in this new light, he continued, opening up more than I'd ever seen him do before. He talked about how exhausting it was to always feel like the one trying to fix things, always the one apologizing, even when he didn't think he'd done anything wrong. He admitted that he'd thought about breaking up with her, but wasn't sure if he had the strength to go through with it. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would make him feel better, but words didn't seem like enough, so I did what felt natural. I leaned in and wrapped my arms around him. It wasn't the kind of hug you give out of politeness or habit. It was real, a way of saying, without words, that I understood and that I was there for him. As we sat together, my arms wrapped around him. Something shifted in the atmosphere. I couldn't tell if it was the way he relaxed into my embrace or the comforting warmth of his presence, but suddenly I became acutely aware of him, the way his hair brushed against my cheek, the faint scent of his collogue, the way his breathing slowed as he settled without much thought. My hand moved to his hair, brushing it back gently. It felt soft under my fingers, and before I realized it, I was tracing the curve of his jaw, then down to his neck. It was an innocent gesture, but it carried a charge. I felt him relax, further leaning into my touch, just slightly. My mind raced, torn between my actions and what I thought I should do. I didn't know why I didn't stop or pull away. Perhaps it was the grounding feeling he gave me, or the emotions of the moment. Whatever it was, I couldn't seem to stop myself. I didn't even recall deciding to. But at some point, I took his hand and placed it on my leg. It was an impulsive move, the kind of thing you do before second-guessing yourself. He froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard. But then his hand settled where I had placed it. I could sense his hesitation, but also his curiosity. His touch was warm, tentative at first, as if unsure whether to move or remain still. Gradually, he began to trace small circles with his fingers along my thigh. Each pass moving slightly higher, my heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my skin. I didn't know where this was leading, but I couldn't make myself stop it. Every nerve in my body felt alive, responding to his touch in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. We stayed like that for what felt like ages, his hand exploring gently while I leaned into him, my face nestled in the crook of his neck. My body seemed to act on its own shifting and arching under his touch, reacting to every small movement he made. And then, just as the intensity reached its peak, the sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. I jumped back so quickly, it was as though I'd been burned, adjusting my dress in record time. My heart raced, now fueled by panic. He looked just as flustered, his face red, as he hurriedly shifted back, putting some space between us. I barely had a moment to collect myself before my parents called out, their voices echoing through the house, filled with a mix of excitement, worry and relief. I forced myself to stand and greet them, my mind still spinning. From what had just happened, they hugged me, tightly bombarding me with questions about why I hadn't warned them of my arrival. I mumbled something about wanting to surprise them, trying to act as normal as possible even as we sat down to dinner. Laughing and catching up, my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in my room. I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way my body had reacted. I couldn't help but wonder if he was thinking about it too. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I went through the motions of talking and laughing with my parents, but my mind was elsewhere. Entirely my thoughts circled back to what had happened with him. The warmth of his hand, the way my body responded, the electricity in the air between us. It all felt so vivid, so fresh, that I couldn't push it away. No matter how hard I tried, even after going to bed that night, sleep evaded me. I tossed and turned, my thoughts running wild, replaying everything over and over, the way he looked at me before we pulled apart, the softness of his touch, closeness. It was all too much to process. I couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking, whether he was as affected by it as I was the next day. Was even harder. Passing him in the house, I felt a strange tension in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it was different. It was as if we both knew what had happened, but didn't know how to address it or act around each other. I caught myself stealing glances at him, noticing things I hadn't before the way. His jawline tightened when he was deep in thought, how his hair fell across his forehead, the way he moved. Every time we crossed paths, my heart would race, and I'd overthink every interaction. Did he notice the way I looked at him? Did he feel the same pull? Or was he just trying to move on as though nothing had happened? I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. My parents were busy for most of the day, leaving me too much time to dwell on everything. I kept reliving that moment in my room, imagining how it could have gone differently. What if the door hadn't opened? What if we hadn't stopped? The endless questions made me restless that evening. As I sat scrolling aimlessly on my phone, my dad came into the living room to tell me he and my mom needed to go out for the night to handle some errands. He apologized for leaving me alone, but I assured him it was fine. Once they left the house, felt eerily quiet. It was just me and him, and the silence seemed to amplify every little sound. I tried to focus on something, reading, watching television, anything to distract myself, but my thoughts kept drifting back to his hand on my leg, to how it had felt being that close. I didn't know when the idea first crossed my mind, but once it was there, I couldn't ignore it. I tried to talk myself out of it, to reason with myself, but the pull was too strong. The memories from the previous day were still too vivid, and the curiosity of what might happen if I didn't hold myself back. This time was far too enticing. It was late when I finally made my decision. The house was silent and dark, and I could faintly hear Joe's steady breathing through the thin walls. My heart thudded in my chest as I quietly made my way to his room, my bare feet gliding noiselessly, over the hardwood floor. When I pushed the door open, I saw him lying on his side, his back turned toward me. He looked peaceful, his breathing deep, and even under the soft glow of the nightlight. For a moment, I just stood there watching him, trying to decide if I would really go through with this. Then before I could second-guess myself, my feet moved on their own, carrying me to his bed. Without thinking further, I slid in beside him, careful not to disturb his sleep. The bed shifted slightly under my weight, and I could feel the warmth of his body so close to mine. At first, I simply lay there, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing and the gentle rise and fall of his chest. But the longer I stayed, the quicker my own breaths became unable to resist. I reached out, letting my fingers graze his arm, lightly testing the waters. It wasn't long before he stirred, his breathing changing. As he began to wake, rolling onto his back, he blinked, confused, as he realized I was there. His surprise was evident. The widening of his eyes showed it clearly. I didn't give him time to speak or react. Instead, I reached for his hand and guided it to my leg. Just like the day before, he paused, his muscles stiffening momentarily under my touch. But then he relaxed, allowing me to take the lead. The next moments were a blur. My senses heightened. I could feel everything, the warmth of his hand, the way his fingers hesitated at first, but then moved with growing confidence. As he grew comfortable, my heart raced, my skin tingled, and I felt entirely consumed by the moment. There was a raw vulnerability in it, something unrefined yet deeply authentic. It didn't need to be perfect. It was the connection that mattered. It was the unspoken understanding between us, the way our bodies seemed to move and sin despite the novelty of the situation. It felt natural, as though we had crossed an unseen line and couldn't go back without conscious thought. I leaned closer to him, closing the space between us. The movement felt drawn out, though it probably lasted just seconds. My hand found his shoulder, and before he could react, I leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was bold, filled with all the tension that had been building between us. Gently but firmly, I guided him backward until he was lying on the couch. Beneath me, I placed my hands on his shoulders as he relaxed AED into the cushions, his hands instinctively settling on my waist. I climbed on top of him, straddling his hips. The sensation of being so close, every inch of our bodies practically touching, was intoxicating. The kiss deepened, becoming slower and more deliberate. I felt his hands tighten slightly on my waist, as if he were trying to anchor himself amidst the intensity of the moment. My hands moved to frame his face, my thumbs brushing again against the scruff, on his jawline, the warmth of his skin, and the roughness of his stubble beneath my fingertips. Scent flutters through my stomach, tilting my head to adjust the angle of the kiss. I felt his lips part slightly, that small motion sending shivers through me as I pressed closer to him. The weight of my body pressed against his, and I took control, setting the pace and rhythm. There was a sense of power in leading, yet it was deeply intimate, the connection raw and consuming. I could feel his heartbeat against me, his hands steady on my waist, as if he couldn't let go. Our breathing grew heavier, perfectly synced with every movement of our lips. Occasionally, I would pull back just enough to look at him, his lighted eyes, his slightly swollen lips, and his chest rising and falling as though he couldn't catch his breath. It was beautiful, and the way he gazed at me in those brief pauses, as though I were his entire world, made my heart feel like it might burst. I leaned in again, trailing kisses along his jawline, his cheek the corner of his mouth, before finding his lips once more. Each kiss felt unique, some quick and playful, others slow, and lingering, as if we were savouring the moment. His hands began to wander, sliding up my back and down to my thighs. There was no rush in his touch. It was deliberate, as though he was letting me lead and trusting me to set the tone. His restraint only heightened. My desire being above him felt so natural, like it was where I was meant to be. I loved how his body responded to mine, the subtle shifts as he tried to get closer despite our closeness. I felt powerful, yet exposed in the best way, completely in control, yet fully open to him. If only he knew how much I had longed for this, how often I'd thought about having him beneath me, letting all the tension between us come to a head the way his hands gripped my waist. And the way he looked at me utterly undone made me want him even more. It wasn't just about the attraction or the chemistry. It was the sheer need to break through the barriers that had kept us apart before. But of course, just as the heat between us reached its peak, reality came crashing in like a wave as I leaned down to kiss him again. My mind jumped ahead. This was the moment I wanted to take it further, to go beyond kissing and touching. My body buzzed with desire, responding to his every move. Then I paused briefly and asked quietly, but firmly, "Do you have anything?" The look on his face was priceless, initial confusion as he processed my words. Then, realization dawning his cheeks, flushed a faint shade of red as he gave me an embarrassed smile. No," he admitted sheepishly. I didn't know we'd. I stared at him for a moment, part disbelief, part exasperation, 18 years old with a girlfriend, and not a single condom. In his room, I let out a frustrated laugh, shaking my head as he tried to defend himself, mumbling something about not expecting this to happen tonight. It was endearing in a completely aggravating way. "Seriously, Joe," I said, still half laughing, mostly trying to keep the mood alive. "What kind of boyfriend doesn't keep protection on hand?" He just shrugged, looking both helpless and a bit apologetic. "I guess I'm not as prepared as I thought," he mumbled, his voice low and unsure. I sighed, letting my head rest against his chest for a moment while I tried to figure out what to do next. The truth was, I didn't want to stop. I couldn't. My feelings for him were too strong, and the idea of leaving things unresolved like this wasn't something I could accept. So I decided to shift direction, to take control of the moment in another way. If he wasn't ready, fine, I'd make sure he'd remember this night forever. I slid downward, my body trailing along his as I moved from his hips to his thighs. The way his breath hitched when I repositioned myself sent a wave of confidence through me. His hands, which had been resting on my waist, shifted slightly, as though unsure of what to do now that the dynamic was changing. Settling between his legs, I aimed up at him, my hands brushing against his knees before gliding up the sides of his thighs. His entire body stiffened as if bracing himself for what might come next. I noticed his breath catch again, and I could feel how hard he was trying to maintain composure, though his body betrayed him with every small reaction. His fingers curled into the couch, cushions, his thighs tensed under my touch, and his chest heaved with deep, uneven breaths. A small smile tugged at my lips as I leaned in to kiss him again, this time lower, sensing the tension in his body increase with each move I made. His responsiveness was intoxicating. I loved knowing I could draw these reactions out of him, that just my presence and touch could make him unravel. I grinned as I planted another kiss on his stomach, letting my hands wander further. His skin was warm beneath my fingers, and every little motion sent another shiver through him. Watching him lose control like this, knowing I was the cause, was electrifying as I continued. I felt him gradually let go of his hesitation. His body relaxed, more sinking into the couch as he released the tension he'd been holding. He began to move with me, subtly at first, his hips shifting slightly, his hands finally finding their way back to me, settling on my shoulders like he needed something solid to hold on to the sound of his breathing and the soft noises he made under his breath only fueled my determination. His sensitivity amazed me. Every little action seemed to amplify his response. It was as if his body was silently guiding me, instinctively showing me what he needed, and I loved it even more than I expected, knowing he was enjoying it so completely that he was entirely at my mercy, made everything even better. At one point, he let out a low, almost inaudible groan, and it sent a jolt of heat through me. I paused, briefly to look at him. His head was tilted back, his lips parted slightly, and his eyes were closed as he surrendered to the moment. He looked so good, so completely vulnerable and undone, and it made me want to keep going when it was all over. I was left with a strange mix of emotions. The adrenaline that had fueled me began to fade, but the buzz in my chest lingered slowly. I stood up from the couch, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. I wasn't sure what. I think part of me was still caught up in the intensity of the experience, how alive it had made me feel. It was like being in a bubble where nothing else mattered, where everything fit perfectly. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, I felt uncertain. I glanced back at him, still lying on the couch. His chest rose and fell steadily as he tried to catch his breath. Though his eyes were closed, he looked peaceful, content, like someone who had just experienced something overwhelming and transformative. His body still hummed with the after effects. I could tell, clearing my throat to break the tension. I tried to sound casual, though my mind was racing. "You're not a virgin, right?" He opened his eyes, meeting mine with a mix of curiosity and confusion for a moment. His expression shifted as though he wasn't sure whether to laugh or take the question seriously. But then, without hesitation, he nodded. "No," he said softly, his voice. "Stay." I raised an eyebrow, studying him, trying to process the information. For some reason, I felt a small wave of disbelief. It was like IID expected him to be someone else, someone different. It was strange, as though the reality of what had happened hadn't quite clicked into place. Yet I didn't say anything else. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, my steps slow. As I tried to collect my thoughts behind me, I could hear him shifting on the couch. But I didn't look back as I moved down the hallway. The full weight of what had just occurred hit me. My body was still buzzing, still alive with the sensations, but my mind was tangled in a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. What had I just done? It felt like I had crossed a boundary I hadn't even known was there. I couldn't explain why it felt this way. The rush, the exhilaration, the connection, and yet the unease settled heavily in my stomach. It was both right and wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It was as if my body had taken over, chasing the experience and letting go of all consequences. Now that the heat of the moment had passed, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way he'd looked at me, the way his body had responded, the way he'd followed my lead without hesitation. It was all so intense, and maybe that's what made it so extraordinary. So unlike anything I'd felt before. Leaning against the wall in the hallway, I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, and sought through the guilt. Yet a part of me craved to feel it again. Every second of what had happened made me want more. Standing there, I realized I needed clarity. I needed to ask myself if what I'd done was okay. Was it wrong? Was it something I should regret? I didn't know. Finally, I walked back toward the room, my heart still racing, unsure of what to do with the swirling emotion. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to forget this night. No matter what conclusion I came to, no matter how I felt, in the end it would stay with me. And as I reflected, I found myself asking, do you think this was right? I needed to know, because I couldn't be the only one who'd ever felt this way. I threw the question out there, hoping someone could help me make sense of it.